Hi, everybody. In this episode, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Simon Ruffell. He is a friend and a close collaborator. I'm working with Simon as one of the teachers on the Psychedelic mentorship program organised by Onaya Health. Dr. Simon Ruffell is a medical doctor, a psychiatrist, and a research psychologist with a PhD in Ayahuasca and mental health. He's also a student of Shibibo shamanism. Dr. Ruffell has worked on several major psychedelic trials at leading universities worldwide, including as a senior research associate on King's College London's psilocybin trial for treatment-resistant depression. Since 2016, his work has been primarily dedicated to exploring the traditional psychedelic brew, ayahuasca. He is the CEO of Onaya Health, where I also serve as an advisor. He co-founded the not-for-profit Onaya Science, which researches the effect of ayahuasca in naturalistic Amazonian settings. Simon's work seeks to understand plants such as ayahuasca from both an indigenous and a Western viewpoint, with the goal of generating a richer understanding of the healing modalities at play. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. Let's get into it. Hey, Simon. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much.
It's so lovely to have you on here. And you and I obviously have known each other now for quite a few years, and we talk a lot. We have lots of interesting conversations, and today we have decided to record one of them.
Yeah, I'm glad we're finally doing this after years of having these conversations.
Yeah, I know. And so do you want to just start by kind of introducing yourself a little bit and just explaining a little bit about how you first got interested in psychedelics and where that began for you?
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a psychiatrist by background.
Mm-hmm.
So I was working as a medical doctor, working in psychiatry in the NHS, which is the National Health Service in the UK, for a few years. And after a while, I began to get, I guess a little bit disillusioned with the way in which we were treating many of our common mental health conditions, particularly the drug treatments. And I found that our patients would just come back time and time again. And we even have a term for that. We call it the revolving door syndrome.
Yeah.
And so I decided to take a bit of a break from medicine to, I don't really know what I was aiming to do. I was aiming to try and find some kind of inspiration. And I ended up working overseas a fair amount, working in psychiatry in different countries, which was awesome. And then eventually my path took me to the Amazon rainforest, where I came across ayahuasca. And I had my first experience drinking ayahuasca, and so it was in a retreat setting, and was pretty amazed by the results that I was seeing in the participants that were on the retreats. And by a fortunate stroke of luck, when I was there, the man who ran the Ayahuasca Foundation had just started building a research center, and he unfortunately didn't have any doctors or researchers who were doing any research into ayahuasca. So he was on the lookout for those people. And so within 6 months, I came back again, and we did our first study looking at the effects of ayahuasca on personality. And then over the years, that just snowballed. This was in 2015, and since then, I actually did a PhD into ayahuasca, ayahuasca and mental health. Amazonian ayahuasca, and founded a research not-for-profit called Onaya Science. And now we do research all year round, looking into ayahuasca in the Amazon rainforest and working with indigenous healers and curanderos.
Beautiful. And what was it in particular that drew you, do you think, to ayahuasca in terms of psychedelic work? Because this podcast is about all kinds of different psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapy. was it just that you happened to be in that place at that time and you met that person and then, or is there something else that for you draws you into that particular medicine?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I definitely was in the right place at the right time with that. But I've also worked with other psychedelics as well. So I used to work on the psilocybin trials at King's College London. I worked in a ketamine clinic at the Maudsley for a little bit as well. And so I have had experience with working with other psychedelics. But the thing that really fascinated me with ayahuasca was the indigenous framework and the fact that there are indigenous communities that are still around today who have mapped out a way to navigate this psychedelic space. And they seem to be saying that there's a completely different way that you can interact with psychedelics and that we don't really acknowledge in the Western, in our Western paradigm, this spiritual component. And that just always fascinated me. So from the very first time when I was drinking ayahuasca in the retreat in the Amazon rainforest, even though I didn't necessarily subscribe to what the indigenous people were saying in terms of there are these spirits that are interacting with us, I was just fascinated by the facts and that they said that, and they were all saying the same thing. And they didn't disagree that, ayahuasca, contains DMT, which acts on serotonin receptors. They wouldn't necessarily phrase it like that. But when I spoke to them about it, they're like, oh, yeah, that can happen. But that allows us to communicate with these spirits. And so I became really interested in that. Is it just another way of describing the healing work that's going on? Why isn't anyone really thinking about this like a lot more? And why in Western science do we all just assume that what indigenous people are saying, or a lot of people assume that what indigenous people are saying is either wrong or it's just a metaphor or it's just theology? And indigenous people definitely are not saying that. They're not saying this is some kind of metaphorical thing. This is the way that they explain what's happening in their treatments. And even more interesting than that is that indigenous people all around the world are saying that and have been saying that for a very long time. And so that really piqued my interest, and then I was hooked.
And we connected on the phone initially, quite a while before you ended up coming because of delays and the whole process. But one of the things that I remember when we first spoke was that we had both kind of worked prior to psychedelics in the refugee mental health space in different ways. And something that I've kind of wondered about for myself is, like, did that work somehow lead me into this kind of field of psychedelic research? And I was reflecting on that kind of over the last few days, thinking about this conversation. And I feel like for me, it really did. And one of the reasons that I feel like it kind of, it was like the seedlings to me getting really interested in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy was because in the work that I was doing, which was working in, first of all, Matai, Myanmar border, and then in Melbourne with refugee populations, a lot of what we were doing was kind of working with people from all over the world, from all different understandings of their distress and frames of reference for making sense of their distress. And we really had to kind of appreciate, explore, and see things from their worldview in order to be helpful, in order to work with people best. And I think that being able to do that has made me really interested in psychedelic work, because what you were talking about before, where we think about kind of the indigenous worldview, and actually even in clinical use of psychedelics, I really feel like we should be holding some of those worldviews in mind. And so that ability to kind of look outside of the generic Western model feels really important to me. And
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I've never, sorry, you go first. You have something to say?
Yeah, no, all good. No, it's funny you brought this up, because I was speaking about this only a few days ago. And like similar to you. So I was working in Uganda. I was working in northern Uganda, in an area that had been really affected by child soldiers. And I was working a psychiatric ward in a hospital. And one of the outreach things that we were doing was to make contact with traditional healers, and to set up these meetings, these kind of teaching days, where for half the day we would talk about Western mental health, and for the other half of the day they would talk about their traditional indigenous healing practices. I found what they were saying just so fascinating, just absolutely fascinating. And once again, it was a completely different paradigm, a completely different way of understanding the world, of understanding illness, of understanding it in the terms of, energy and spirits. And yet again, the traditional healers were saying things that everybody resonated with and everybody agreed with. And all the locals were using these practices seemingly to great effect. I think, many people would say, if you're engaging in these traditional medicines, they lack efficacy. There aren't clinical trials that are proving that this stuff works. It's just placebo. None of it's actually true. But one thing that really struck me is, and this has kind of come across with the research as well, is that we arguably lack the tools to investigate many of these things. And so when people are saying, well, there's no evidence to, support the fact that, that spirits aren't causing healing in, for example, ayahuasca ceremonies.
Yeah.
But how do we know that? How do we know that? And with the way that we conduct research, we're doing our best. So, for example, we did some studies where we were looking at the effects of different medicinal songs like Icaros on brainwaves to see if they have an effect. But at the same time, I'm sure that's not what the Shipibo are talking about when they say that Icaros are having an effect. They're not talking about the impact it's having on electricity in the brain. It might show up there, but they're talking about something very different. Though because it's in a completely different paradigm, it's extremely difficult for us to investigate. A good starting place would be, to take the concept seriously and to work with indigenous healers in this area to see if we can begin to investigate these things. And that's before we even get into the ethics of whether we should be, whether we're placing science in a way where it could either validate or not validate indigenous practices. And so I think we need to be working towards descriptive science in that area.
What do you think is the way forward to kind of bring this kind of scientific approach into the kind of work that we're doing in psychedelics with ayahuasca in particular? What's important for people to bear in mind?
Yeah. I mean, I think a few things. Firstly, just going back to randomized control trials and the clinical model. I have absolutely nothing against those. Those trials are fantastic. That's the gold standard that we have for determining whether drug treatments are effective. But that's really important to remember. They're designed for pharmacological treatments. That's what they're for. They work to reduce the confounding variables, extra pharmacological variables, things outside of the drug environment get reduced so that we can just focus on the effects of the drug. But we could argue that that's not appropriate for other kinds of treatments. And psychedelics, there's been some question as to whether randomized control trials are the best fit for psychedelic medications. And there are definitely challenges to do with that. But when we're looking at indigenous ways of working and ways of thinking, if we're reducing ayahuasca, for example, going back to your question, down to just DMT and monoamine oxidase inhibitors, that's arguably not ayahuasca. I mean, the Shipibo who I work with in the Amazon rainforest, they say that the main part of the treatment comes through the medicinal healing songs and comes through the Icaros. And so what do we do to begin to investigate this from a scientific point of view? I think, well, first of all, we need to make sure that indigenous peoples want to investigate it from a scientific point of view. And I mean, the curanderos, the shamans that I work with, they definitely do. And so I think that it's a case of opening up the dialogue with them from the very beginning and including them at every stage of the research process. So from study conception to the interpretation of results, and then also making sure that all of those findings are accessible to those communities that we work with. And so when we begin to do that, I mean, we have our Indigenous Advisory Board, which is a bunch of people curanderos, and we try to, as best we can, work with them at every stage of the research process. And they're always asking for us to look at things that are really hard to look at. So the last thing...
Yeah, I was going to say, give us an example of that. That's what, and how that conversation came about as well. Like how they...
Yeah. I mean, it's normally me sitting down, asking them what they want to look at.
Yeah.
And then there's normally a lot of laughing in my face, and that happens quite a lot.
I bet.
So the last couple of things they said was to look at the effects of different icaros and different medicinal healing songs on participants. And then they wanted to look at the role of faith. That was like a huge thing, to look at the role of faith has in healing. They say the Shipibo always talk about having faith in the plants, faith in the spirit is the most important thing. Which obviously I think some people would say, well, that's just placebo. But again, I think there's a bit of an issue when we discount everything as placebo and thinking that that's not, that could be the key. It could be that we're harnessing something, something that's free, something that has no side effects, something maybe we should be looking into more.
Yeah, it is. And have you done the research yet that you were just talking about with icaros?
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, I mean, this work is so challenging on many levels. So we ended up putting EEG caps on participants within a ceremony, and then recording Don Rono singing his icaros, and then timestamping the recordings of Rono singing icaros, and timestamping the change in electrical activity in the brain. And then what we were going to do was to translate Rono Shipibo icaros and then see if there's any correlation between him singing a protection icaro, for example, versus a healing icaro and changes in brainwaves. But before we did that, there was just something that didn't feel right. And I was speaking to a couple of senior researchers who work with ayahuasca, and we all had some concerns about bringing in technology like EEG into shamanic ceremonies in the Amazon rainforest. For a few reasons. One, it felt to me a little bit invasive actually during the ceremony. And so now when we use EEG, we use it before and after in the hotel room, before people go into the jungle. And then also, my concern was that might open up the floodgates for other researchers, thinking that was okay. And I think, we've been working with the Shipibo since 2015, so we have good working relationships with them. I know them, I know the curanderos that we work with really well, but I was also slightly concerned that it might be too much, firstly for me to do it, but then other people who hadn't built those relationships over time might think, oh, this is a completely legitimate way to do science. And then it could become extractive and exploitative. So we just decided not to analyze the data, at least for now, and just stop doing that side of the research. So that's where we're at with it.
I think what you're talking about is so important, isn't it? There's so many different layers of complexity when you are trying to do this really well. And I think something that I know from your work is that it's really important to you to work in partnership with Indigenous healers in a way that feels right to you and to them. And there's so much to that. It takes time, right? Like I worked at Foundation House in Australia, which is a service, a refugee mental health service. We had a lot of advisory group models that we would use to kind of set up services. And, it takes a lot longer to do things. Everything's a lot slower. It's very relational, but it's so much more powerful than and more useful, I think, than us going in with our Western framework. Try to kind of provide a service.
Yeah, for sure. And there are some really good examples of, Western science working in partnership with indigenous peoples. Not so much in the psychedelic space, but yeah, there's some really good examples of people working with, I think, with Inuit communities, if I remember correctly, and going into the communities, speaking to the Inuit people, and figuring out what they would like to research and what they need help with, and then working together to reduce disease burden based on the information that the Inuit people were giving. So they helped design these studies through and through. I mean, one thing that I found is that, yeah, you're right. Working in partnership with Indigenous healers is super, super important, super important to me and to the work that we do at Onaya. But it's also incredibly hard. Like the practicalities of doing that are really, really hard. And, you know, Don Rona and the Indigenous curanderos, they're not trained in Western science. So that already means that there's a power imbalance because we're producing all the research and we're trying to interpret what they're saying. And so already you're on slightly uneven grounds. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be trying. You definitely should, but it's an ongoing work in progress for sure.
Yeah. It's come up a lot here. So obviously in Australia at the moment, we are moving through kind of the first steps of clinical use of psychedelic medicine in terms of we're working with psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy and to treat depression at the moment, and MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And, I've had quite a few conversations with people who are really interested in, really very much aware of Indigenous wisdom being something that's really important in this space. And how do we hold that in mind as we move towards clinical practice in a way that feels okay, useful? And I don't know that anyone has any answers to this, but I don't know, like, what do you think in terms of kind of moving into clinical practice here? You've had a bit to do with Australia. What do you think for someone who's interested in finding out more about how to do that? Where would you be sending them?
It's all about open dialogue and relationships, I think.
Yeah, totally.
It has to just be including Indigenous healers from the very beginning, and then working with them to try and co-design these studies. I think that there are a few major issues. One is tokenization, and just thinking, oh yeah, Indigenous wisdom, we can put like a little statue of Ganesh in the room, and that's fine. And I've seen that so much. Just like Daddy Charles, you like walk into the psychedelic room, and there's just random paraphernalia from different religions across the world. And it's like, there you go. There's the spiritual aspect of it sorted.
Yeah.
Including Indigenous people from the very beginning. There's also issues to do with recognition as well, like recognition of, for a better sense of word, qualifications. But of course, Don Rono and the Indigenous people that I know from Australia, I mean, some of them have Western style qualifications, but most of them, quite rightly, have trained in their own Indigenous practices. Many of them are super senior, they're super experienced, they have a high level of expertise. But we don't recognize that. And so I think, again, recognizing different ways of acquiring knowledge and then working with those people together. But again, this is what we're talking about here is absolutely huge. This is it's not a small thing. It basically pulls the rug, or has the potential to pull the rug from outside of the science's feet. And so it makes sense that scientists are just like, well, what the hell are you talking about? These people aren't qualified in the way that we're qualified. It's not safe. This can't be done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's really important when we're now working with Indigenous medicines. If we're working with Indigenous medicines, this is something that we need to really consider. But I mean, a question on my mind is science ready for this? Is science ready for all of these concepts that arise when we work with Indigenous plant medicines? Is science ready to actually acknowledge Indigenous peoples, rather than just saying, oh, yes, we need to be acknowledging or whatever, giving 10% of profits back? It's like, well, no, this is really about having that openness and respect for other cultures rather than placing Western science in a dominant position.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's such an important point, what you just said about like, is science ready? Are we ready for that? But we have
Yeah.
to start somewhere too, right? We have to start
Yeah.
somewhere. And I think, people are quite interested and wanting to. And then I really resonated with what you just said around thinking about different ways of acquiring knowledge and being really kind of clear that and wanting to kind of understand that more in a kind of more in a deeper way. Because you're a psychiatrist and you've trained in that model, but you're also training in a type of shamanism. Do you want to speak to that as well? Are you?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I've been training in Shipibo, collaborator, which is Shipibo shamanism,
Yeah.
since 2019. And that's a completely different paradigm. It's a completely different way of thinking about the world, of thinking about mental health, of thinking about nature and spirituality. And I think that if we're really serious about progress, in my opinion, is when we can combine those worlds, where we can combine the psychology with shamanism. Because one of the issues that I've come across, and this is kind of the flip side of the coin of working with indigenous medicines, is yes, they can be fantastic. Yes, they can be amazing. And there are other issues, kind of like a lack of regulation when it comes to Westerners using them and people not being properly trained. But one of the major things that I've come across is the confusion when you tap into these different worldviews and these different paradigms. And I've definitely had this, like especially with the training that I've been doing, where you start experiencing things and indigenous people start describing things to you from their paradigm, where suddenly it's a fact that spirits are real. You're interacting with these energies. And it can lead to something called ontological shock, which is when you question your worldview, and it can lead to a sense of confusion and anxiety. And then the other thing that we see are when people have these experiences with what they perceive to be spirits, and then become quite grandiose or get this kind of spiritual narcissism and think, right, that's it. I had this contact with the spirit. I'm on a mission, and I am the reincarnation of Christ, or something like that. So I think if we're going to be, again, working with these concepts and working with indigenous peoples, we need to think very carefully about how we ground and anchor this into the Western framework. I think there are ways to do that. I mean, as part of Onaya now, we're developing preparation and integration courses. We already have developed preparation and integration courses for people undergoing psychedelic experiences that come at it from both a shamanic and a Western psychological and psychiatric lens. And then equally, we're now developing courses that are training therapists to be trained in both having an idea of the shamanic worldview and the Western psychological worldview and how these things link together, and also where they don't, so that we can try and equip people to better understand and get less confused and hopefully avoid some of the negative effects that tapping into another paradigm can result in.
Yeah. I think, I think it's really, I think people can probably resonate with what you spoke about ontological shock. And also, if you've sat in ceremonies, you've probably met people who connected with some kind of spirit and maybe got a bit grandiose afterwards. And so that sounds like a really interesting and important approach to kind of bring those two things together. And so for people who want to find out more about that, do you have any idea about when that's going to be available?
Yeah, so the preparation and integration courses are available now. You can get them at our website, onaya.io, which is onaya.io. For the training courses, so we actually have our first cohort starting the course this week. And then this is really it's the beta version. So it's the trial version. And we're going to be opening up the first cohort to the general public in August, September time.
Amazing.
So yeah, please do check that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I have a few ways I could go with the next question, but are there particular kind of therapeutic modalities that you think lend themselves particularly well to kind of bringing together with the shamanic approaches?
Yeah, IFS, internal family systems, is naturally quite shamanic. Looking at the kind of the multiplicity of self, these different parts of you, different parts that come up. And this is something that people talk about spontaneously a lot in psychedelic ceremonies, these different parts of them. Dick Schwartz, who invented IFS, even talks about different energies that are external to you as well, but that you can interact with, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's sounding very similar to a lot of the work that these indigenous curanderos are talking about with energies that might interact with us that are outside of us. So I think the IFS is a really fantastic tool. It's not without its issues. Like you definitely have to watch out for describing things as multiplicity of mind, because people can start thinking that their self is fractured, and you've got to watch out for that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But in general, I think that using that kind of a language can help be a bridge between more shamanic ways of thinking and working and Western psychological frameworks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you about IFS. I feel like it's got that kind of natural approach where they're talking about parts. And I think that, there's a book called The Others Within Us that is written by a colleague of Dick Schwartz, actually, Bob Falconer, I think it is. And he talks a lot about unattached burdens, he calls them, which sounds a lot like entities, but he doesn't. He kind of leaves it open for us to interpret a little bit, however we want, and names up all different kind of cultures from across the world that talk about these things in different ways, which I think is really interesting. I also think about kind of as a bias in me probably, but I'm a somatic therapist, as you know, and I do think when a lot of somatic psychotherapy kind of has its roots in some indigenous practices as well, in terms of the shaking, the movement, and the use of rhythm and things like that. I think actually, there's quite a lot of crossover there too.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's really interesting with the unattached burdens. I remember I was doing a training course in IFS, and somebody asked Dick Schwartz about the unattached burdens, and he basically said, if I remember correctly, that he didn't want to write too much about that when he was getting IFS validated, because he thought people wouldn't take it seriously. But it's definitely a thing. So he just kind of left it as a footnote, which is why people seem to be talking about it a little bit more now, because now IFS is recognized. But yeah, he's done a great job of getting a pretty shamanic framework into a Western into a Western setting, which is is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a question that it's kind of related to that, and kind of I think that he was quite worried about putting that book out, the book I was talking about before. He had a foreword in there about kind of, he was nervous about Bob Falconer talking about this kind of unattached burdens. He doesn't want IFS to be discredited. And, I think we've come a long way in the space. And I think, if you think about where we were even 15 years ago with psychedelic research and psychedelic medicine, we're so much further along for it to become kind of almost mainstream. Is it mainstream? Like, what do you think? I think there's still some tensions in the field about these kind of conversations. And I'd love to unpack that a little bit, because it's been something that's been on my mind recently. I was like, when you're working in a field, you kind of are in a certain space, and you feel like everyone else around you is kind of knows lots about psychedelic medicine, knows lots about this kind of work. But actually, I think still people feel slightly freaked out by talking about unattached burdens or entities. I don't know. What do you think?
I think people are probably still quite freaked out and talking about entities. I don't think that is
Yeah.
in mainstream psychiatry quite yet. But in general, psychedelic research, I think it's really difficult not to take the psychedelic research seriously if you're a serious researcher.
Yeah.
There are psychedelic research departments at every major university that I'm aware of, and the field's moved a long way. Like I remember when I applied to train in psychiatry at King's College London, I was advised not to mention any of the work that I've been doing into psychedelics and ayahuasca in my interview. And so I literally had a period of about 6 months where in the interview they said, "Oh, what were you doing for this 6 months?" And I've been doing research into ayahuasca. I had to say, just nothing. Just I'm backpacking. I've been doing research, which later became my PhD.
How long ago was that? When was this?
That was 2016, 17. Yeah.
Okay.
And then pretty soon after that, there were psychedelic research departments that were formed, at King's and these other places. And so I think it's very difficult to not at least consider the possibility that psychedelics may be an effective medicine. There's a flip side to this, and I think that many people think that they're going to save the world. And what we're seeing in a lot of these clinical trials is that, they're good, but, they're not that good. They seem to be as good as the best antidepressants that we already have. And many people are disappointed by that. But I would also kind of argue with that, well, if you treat it like a serotonin agonist, if you treat it like an antidepressant, you're going to get an antidepressant. You're reducing it into one tiny thing in a hospital-based setting and really kind of making it quite similar to the way that we use antidepressant drugs, just with a lot of additional psychotherapy. Obviously, it's not quite as simple as that, but I think there's a lot more that we can be doing with psychedelics when we work in collaboration with indigenous communities.
Yeah, which is obviously the work that you have been doing and will be doing more of with Onaya.
Yeah.
So a lot of people listening to this podcast are going to be kind of sort of people who are trained as psychotherapists and kind of wanting to work in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So I'm going to get slightly nerdy on that for a moment, if that's all right.
Sure, that's fine.
So when you were kind of thinking about the courses that you are writing for Onaya, the therapist training, how did you decide which parts of the clinical knowledge to include and which parts to include from Shabibu? That's probably a big question, but.
Yeah, that's quite a difficult one to answer. I mean, we're trying to avoid just using information from Shipibo culture, but more indigenous concepts as a whole. So it's really, this course is a 4-month course. So it provides you with a good knowledge base, a good baseline structure for how indigenous knowledge and indigenous concepts could fit with psychology. But obviously, if you want to delve deeper into Tibetan Buddhism or Shipibo Koren Buddhism or whatever it is, then you're going to need to probably go and train with that community. So yeah, it's really these baseline concepts. But there are a lot of ways that they do overlap, and so we're trying to find those places where they overlap, and then really kind of emphasize that, and then also common pitfalls that might arise and what to do with them.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think that's a really important distinction, that you're kind of working with indigenous concepts in general rather than just one particular thing. Because I feel like that feels really important, actually.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's important. We're designing the course. The way that we're doing it is we're getting experts in to teach about different things.
Yeah.
So, for example, we have Shipibo curanderos who are coming in to teach about Shipibo concepts. And we have people who have trained in Tibetan Buddhism teaching about that. But I think it's also important that we're not, suddenly teaching about Shipibo.
Exactly. Yeah.
That I think that's a little bit, that's not our place. It's not our place to do that. But it is our place to find commonalities and how that intersects with psychology to try and help participants from going west when they engage in different paradigms.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense to me that, if you want to dive really deeply into Shipibo curanderism, then you should go and train in that.
Yeah.
But there are some concepts that are kind of there's a lot of similarities in certain concepts that you see all in indigenous cultures all across the world, isn't that?
Yeah.
Kind of
Absolutely.
bring together.
Yeah, for sure. So, for example, thinking about the importance of dreams, like a dreamscape, that's a huge thing with indigenous peoples and that I'm aware of, like from all around the world. And then it also lends itself to psychoanalysis, and all these different areas. So that's quite a good example of how we can bring these things together and how we can think about dreams from different ways of thinking. Yeah, there are a few ways that they do overlap.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I really wanted to kind of zoom in on the concept of reciprocity because you talk about that on your website and it's a really important part of the work that you do at Onaya. Do you want to define what you mean by that and how you use that in the work that you do?
Yeah, I understand reciprocity to be sharing the benefits with the people of the work that you're doing with the people that you're working with, especially when you're using concepts and medicines that belong to a different culture. So there are many ways to do this, and the most obvious one is financially. And there is a reality that a lot of these indigenous communities, they really, a lot of the Shipibo live in poverty. It's really, really tough in the Amazon rainforest. And so we work with other organizations like ICEAS and Shakruna. I definitely recommend people check those websites out. And they work to support indigenous communities all around the world. But those are two of the organizations that we collaborate with and we support. But then there are other ways to engage in reciprocity as well. So, for example, sharing knowledge. This actually is really cool. There's a group of indigenous Australian people who are just about to head over to go and see Don Rono next month to do a knowledge exchange, which is really cool. So that's like a really, really awesome way of sharing knowledge and like sharing the benefits of different things that you know. And then in terms of science as well, so working together with indigenous people. So in our last paper, because Rono came up with the concept of wanting to communicate with to measure the communication of humans and plants, that's what we wanted to look at. We designed a study that looks at nature relatedness, looking at how people feel connected to nature, whether they feel that they can, even communicate it, that they're one with nature. And he was involved in all the data collection for that as well, because he's running the ceremonies. So he's an author on that, the scientific paper. So that's another way that we can collaborate with these, with indigenous peoples and make sure that they're getting the benefits for this as well. Another thing that we do is to write layperson summaries of our research and then translate them into Spanish so that they can be distributed around the communities that we're working with so that everybody knows, if they want to, if they're interested, can read about the work that we're doing or why it's being done. And of course, we have to make sure that when we're working with indigenous communities, there's always a free and prior informed consent so that they're happy for us to do this research. They know the direction that it's going in. They know what the results might be and also what might happen when we publish these papers, what could happen as a result of that. So there are many ways to engage in reciprocity, but it's also, it's hard. It's It's much easier said than done to say, oh yeah, we're working in collaboration with indigenous healers. It's tough. Like it's tough to figure out how to do that in a, in a substantial way that's actually meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that idea of kind of getting consent first, with what you're going to do in a way that's meaningful, in a way that they understand is so important. And I think, often when I've heard reciprocity talked about, it is often, okay, we're just going to give a portion of the profit to said organization. And I really respect how you guys go, your work goes a lot deeper than that, not just about that.
We tried to do it on 3 different levels. So we tried to do it on the ground, so working with indigenous peoples that we know personally, to try and provide personal benefits to those that we're actually collaborating with. And then we tried to do the middle level, which is indigenous peoples as a whole, and that's where working with ICEERS and Shakuna comes in.
Yeah.
And that's largely kind of financial. And actually, no, that's not true. It's not just financial. I do a lot of talks with Shakuna and work with them and, try and support that organization in other ways that's not financial. And then the final layer is environmentally. So we also support organizations that engage in reforestation and agroforestry to try and protect, the Amazon rainforest. So I think there's always really 3 tiers that you can think of. And if you're covering those 3 tiers, it doesn't mean that you're doing it right, but it's a good start to make sure that you're doing as much as you can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for explaining all of that. I think it's really important because people have been thinking about it here as well and talking about it a lot, but I think that gives a really clear kind of way that people can engage and start to understand that a bit more.
Yeah, it's a nice structure to start with.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So, well, you and I are both kind of working in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy in different ways, right? So you spoke about the courses that you're running and the work that you're doing with Onaya around the kind of prep, ceremonial navigation, and then integration. And I've been working in psychedelic research, looking at psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy to treat anxiety disorder. We've actually wrapped that up now. Now we're opening up the clinic, people getting started there, which is great. And I guess I'm just thinking about, what do you think is different about the 2 ways that you and I are working in this space at the moment, although we're also doing some work together? And what do you think is similar?
I mean, I think there are clear similarities in terms of trying to harness the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. But obviously the setting's different. And I think that there's enough space for both, I think it's all about accessibility and I guess the work that I'm doing has a much heavier spiritual component. Not to say that the work that you're doing doesn't have a spiritual component, but it's different. The way that people connect with spirit in clinical trials, in my experience, has been more along the lines of, connect to the spirit of yourself, or, feel more connected to nature and to your family. Yeah. But in indigenous work, it's literally like there is a spirit over there. You need to try and connect with it and communicate with it. It's a slightly different take on it. But I think what's really important with psychedelics is accessibility as well, and making sure that these are accessible to people who need it. Yeah. And for many people listening, they might, listen to what I'm saying and think, either that sounds like, complete horseshit, or, that's definitely not something I want to engage in.
Yeah.
In which case, fine, that's absolutely fine. And there are many people that will feel much more comfortable receiving a tablet of MDMA or a capsule of psilocybin from a doctor in a white lab coat in a clinic, in which case, great. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. Go ahead and do that. That's awesome. But then there are other people as well who would think, well, I resonate a lot more with these structures that are already in existence. I don't want to be taking it in a clinical setting, in a clinical framework. And they might think, I want to engage in this more kind of indigenous spiritual worldview, in which case that's also totally fine as well. So I think they're both, they're both striving for the same end, aren't they? They're both striving for the same goal. It's just a different way of accessing it.
Yeah.
Obviously, with the indigenous worldviews, it's not just about healing. You can work with psychedelics for a wide variety of other things as well. I mean, in the clinical settings, hopefully everyone's just focused on healing. So that would be maybe one difference in the work that happens that people seem quite reluctant to talk about, which I understand. But yeah, I think there's definitely room for both.
I think so too. And I think I've noticed, I think there's definitely going to be people who feel much more comfortable and perhaps need that extra kind of support of having two psychotherapists with them for the whole journey that are the same people that do the kind of psychotherapy before, that do the dosing, that continue to work with them afterwards. And also that just feel more comfortable in that space. And the way that we're working with them, we're kind of using the dosing sessions as very much kind of a way to go deeper with psychotherapy, which I don't know if that's necessarily always the case in the clinical setting, but that's definitely how we're using it. And we're working with people over like 6 month period. And so I think some people will feel more drawn to that. And some people are going to feel more drawn to medicines like MDMA or psilocybin versus ayahuasca as well. But other people are going to think they really want to sit in ceremony and they want to sit in a group and they want to be more kind of interested and then more kind of held by the indigenous practices and worldview. And I think that's okay. I think there's a really beautiful space for both. And I think...
No.
Sorry. You go.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, another interesting difference is that community side of things as well. Because it's such a Western thing to think of treatments as individual and you go through it by yourself and, it's all about the individual. Whereas this is much more indigenous point of view to think about things as a collective and to go into ceremony as a collective. And it's for the benefit of the group. And many people resonate with that a lot more. But also, I think some people will feel like they need that support from two therapists. But we're also beginning to see clinical psychedelics and being used more in group settings now. There are a few studies starting up. So it'll be interesting to see the effects of that.
And yeah, definitely. And I think there is something important about community that comes up in general with psychedelic healing and psychedelic medicine, psychedelic therapy. I guess the way that I've always thought about healing in humans is in an interconnected way. So, when a client sits in front of me, I'm meeting with them and I can do all sorts of work with them and that's great. But then I send them home to their family structure where things are not working and it's not going to be as effective. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I've had all sorts of ideas about this, is how do we bring more people from someone's family system into the therapeutic work that we're doing. And now that we're outside of a trial setting, we've got so much more flexibility to do work with couples, to do work with family groups, but also to do group work for people who are definitely setting up kind of integration circles and groups, which is a way to bring people into connection with each other. Was just at the beginning, and we're still quite restricted in how we are able to use psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and what for in terms of the Western models of mental health, that we can only use it for treatment-resistant depression with psilocybin and MDMA for PTSD at the moment.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, that's something we go into in the courses quite a lot. The importance of, this community and this connection and how that's emphasized in Indigenous communities a lot. And yeah, I'm really excited to see how the clinical use of psychedelics changes as we move out of hospitals and into clinics, as you say, because there's a lot more flexibility. We're no longer restricted by the randomized control model, which is fantastic when you're trying to prove the safety or determine the safety and the efficacy of a treatment. But now we're outside of that. I'm excited to see, excited to see what that looks like. And it might be that there's a lot more scope for bringing in some of these indigenous concepts into that kind of work. So we'll leave the mantle with you, Esme, and the responsibility to try and do that in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I want the whole mantle and the whole responsibility, but
the whole thing on you.
But definitely, it's something that we have been thinking and talking a lot about. So I want to go back to what you shared before about that sometimes when people have contact with a spirit in a session, they come out and they feel like in a ceremony, they seem grandiose or there's something kind of intense going on for them. How would you support someone like that if you were working with them in the jungle? And then maybe I can talk a bit about how I might work with something like that in clinical setting.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think providing a safe support structure is super, super important. So making sure that they have people that they can talk to, they can talk through this experience with and come to understand what that experience might mean. So, for example, if somebody feels that they've had a contact with the spirit of Jesus Christ and now they are, the second coming of Christ, and they have a mission that they need to do, they would maybe speaking to them about what that could mean, what that contact could mean, rather than jumping to a conclusion that that they are Christ themselves.
Yeah.
Could there be other explanations? Could there be other reasons? And try to ground that experience because it has the potential to be a really positive experience. They've suddenly filled with this sense of belonging or this sense of peace, to try and help them to come to terms with what's happened in a way that they can integrate that into their life without causing damage to themselves and to others.
Yeah.
So I'd say it would be a lot of unpacking what actually happened and exploring what it actually could mean. I would stay away from obviously confirming that's the case or saying, this is wrong, like you are wrong. There will be something in there and they just need help to understand what that experience or that process could mean.
Yeah. It's so interesting listening to you because I'm thinking about how we would work with something a bit similar in a trial space. And it's very similar to what you just described as two therapists supporting someone who had had contact with some kind of spirit, even if they're attributing it to a positive or negative experience. The way we would work is quite similar in that we wouldn't kind of confirm that that's definitely the case or deny it. We would kind of just sit with and unpick and untie and get to the core of what that might mean for them. Not taking things too literally is something that we always talk to people about, and kind of sitting with something for a little while before you kind of make any big decisions, but also that, what does it mean to them in their life? And we eventually might look at like how that interacts with their history, but we wouldn't do that initially. Very much in the kind of early stages, we're really just listening and holding space for, and kind of maybe also untying any unhelpful conclusions a little bit, which is, but not just, that's not about saying this is real or not real. It's like, what does that mean to you? And how does that make sense for your life? And maybe if Jesus Christ told you to go and quit your job tomorrow and move to an island in the Pacific, don't rush to do that just yet. Just kind of pause and sit with, and maybe that's not exactly, it's really important not to take things too literally and to let things settle, because when someone comes out of an experience, they can have one way of meaning making with it, and that can really shift, especially over the kind of few days and weeks in afterwards as well.
For sure, for sure. I mean, it's such good advice to leave all major decisions for at least a month after you've had a psychedelic experience. And there's such a huge issue with people taking these things literally or misinterpreting, especially when you're from a Western background. Or, what's your own mind? What's a spirit? Is there a difference? Is there just consciousness? What is real? The path is fraught with all of these pitfalls. And you see so many of these examples of people misinterpreting information or following something like ayahuasca. Ayahuasca told me so. And so for a while, there was a really good reminder in the Amazon River in Iquitos, where somebody had been told by ayahuasca they needed to build a floating pyramid on the Amazon basin. There was going to be a retreat center. And so they went home. I think they're from Australia, actually. They went home and, if I've got this right, they sold all their stuff, much to the dismay of their wife and family, and built a floating pyramid, which abruptly sank and was just poking out of the Amazon River. And so whether or not ayahuasca did tell this person to build a pyramid is up for discussion, but I think that I think this is a really good example of not taking what comes up in ceremony literally as well, and taking time to let it settle, taking time to let it integrate. What does it mean to you? What's the effect that it's had on you? And not rushing into anything. That's really, it's such a common thing that we see with psychedelics, especially ayahuasca.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really, really important advice, and one that we definitely will give people on this when we're working with psilocybin as well. Yeah. And I think, what I love about this work is that people find their own ways to integrate as well. Like you can kind of just, sometimes people will come and ask me, like, what can I do to integrate a psychedelic experience and how do I do that? And there are obviously kind of like some basic things that are really important in terms of like letting it settle, and journaling for some people is really good, or drawing, or kind of sitting and really important to talk with another person for some people. It's not a one size fits all approach. And have people get really, if you give people the space to get to find their own way, sometimes they get really creative. We had one person who used AI image generating to create images of the gods that he met, and really, really cool, and showed them to us, which was really amazing for us to be able to see, because so often we think, I wish I could see and be where that person has been with them, because they have such a hard thing to put into words. And I'm sure there was a lot more to his experience than what he was able to show us in this image, but he said it was a really clear similarity and helped him to remember, to feel connected to that experience, which for him was a really positive one. So slightly less complex than if someone has a big grandiose experience, but it was a really beautiful kind of, and we would never have suggested that. I wouldn't have even thought of it. He just came up with it himself. That's
really cool. Yeah. There's a lot of other people doing that as well, actually, using AI to try and recreate trip experiences. I've never tried it, but it sounds, it sounds super interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure there'll be lots more kind of ways of working with technology that people will try as things move on in that space.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Well, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to bring up or mention before we finish today, Simon?
No, I don't think so. But I am very interested to see how the clinic that you're helping to run pans out, especially as you begin to have a little bit more freedom outside of the hospital trial space. And I wonder what that will look like. And I wonder how if it will be possible to work with indigenous Australians during that That would be awesome. Yeah. There's exciting times in Australia. A lot of potential for good.
Yeah, I think so. And there's definitely so many exciting ideas that we've got already. And also, like, one of my biggest hopes is that, in the randomized control trials are really important, and that research is really important to, as you said, kind of work out the safety and efficacy of treatments. But the other part of research that's really important is research outside of a trial setting, in a clinical setting. And so we're really excited to be able to start doing some of that in a more naturalistic environment as well.
Yeah.
And maybe kind of we'll be able to work more with families and carers and systems around people too. So that would be good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited to see how that pans out.
Thank you. Thank you for coming on today, Simon.
Always good to see you, Esme. Looking forward to seeing you next time.
Yeah, I'll see you soon.